All right. Thank you, Joel. Why don't I hand it off to you and let you take it away?
Awesome. Thanks so much, man. I will go ahead and do the normal screen sharing. I know it's I shouldn't have to do these things because we've been remote for so long, but is it fair to say you all see okay, cool. So I run Linux. I've done it. I used to work for Red Hat and I run Linux. And so I never know if things are going to work or not. I never know if the microphone's going to work. So it's always a fun guess. Anyway, so the talk today is this idea around scaling. Give you, Anthony did a nice kind of background on myself. So I appreciate that. I'll tell you a little bit about myself here. And we'll get into like the root of it. As I mentioned to some of the group before we got going here, kind of an engineer, kind of architect by trade, right? So I did a bunch of the low latency, high throughput systems for the futures exchange in Chicago, did all that fun stuff. That's actually where I got introduced to David Hussman and started getting introduced into the early Agile space, some of the XP stuff early on. From there, I was an architect at Red Hat, and then like the last, I don't know, decade, 12 years or so, I started doing like a bunch of the Agile coaching stuff, right? And so for a long time, that was, you teach like a 2-day workshop or something like that, then everybody was supposed to know what to do, and they would leave, and then real world would hit and nothing would stick. Or you teach them test driven, or you teach them something else, and then you'd have to say, why aren't you doing the things? It was so easy in the class. Anyway, so what we started doing for like the last 7 or 8 years was like this immersive learning stuff. And that's what the book was about. But anyway, like the way it ties into like this whole scaling thing is I get asked all the time about scaling. Because like the things we're trying to do is help teams learn new practices, build products. And everybody's always like, how does that scale? And it's always like, you keep on asking me things or how does this scale, but I don't even know what you mean by scale. And so that's kind of like the root of where this is really coming from. Look, that's just a little bit more about me, right? I pose like that a lot when I'm in public. So now you get the feel of both sides of it. But yeah, the biggest thing is really just this idea of always being asked about scaling. So like the arc for our time together, right? I think it's fundamental that we start off by trying to come up with what scaling could mean, as opposed to what it does mean. Let's talk about what it could mean. Figure out why we even care about the problem, or if it's a problem in the first place, and then based upon those ideas of what scaling could mean and what we want it to mean, what are our options? The thing that I find most interesting about this is like, if we can get people to agree upon what they mean by scaling, then we can actually have interesting conversations. We can actually say, if we want X to happen, that means we are not going to do Y, right? We can be very explicit about the things that we want to do, but if we just use fuzzy words, then we're always talking in circles here. For me, the outcome that would be ideal for you all to get from this is really maybe just some frames. When you hear people talking about scaling, some frames that you could use to have them clarify what they mean, and then have a better conversation around, again, these kind of trade-offs and what might happen. All right, so feel free to pepper the questions as we go, but this is kind of like the arc, and this is where we're going. So like the fun start, right? When you think of scaling, what do you all think of? As a reference point there, that is not, Han Solo is not to scale for the Millennium Falcon there, right? That is not appropriate. Anthony, what do you think of, dude? What do you think of when you think of scaling? Somebody says, how does that scale? What do you think of, man?
How to do that same, practice across a larger part of the organization, typically.
Yeah, how do we do that one thing over and over again? What do you, Alex, Nick, what do you guys think? Anything different?
Yeah, I think of running an experiment at a smaller, for lack of a better term, scale, and then doing the thought experiment of how will that act as you bring it up.
How would it change? How would it modify to make it go larger, go different?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing as Alex.
Yeah. So this is a good group then. I appreciate that. Usually when we get into people talking about scaling, people are talking about frameworks, the framework that won't be mentioned, per se. But
You
people
can
are
imagine.
thinking about people are thinking about a variety of things. They're thinking about, is there a structure in place that when I want to do this one thing more broadly, is there a structure in place that makes it easy to do it? Sometimes when people are thinking about scaling, they're just thinking about, I have a lot of teams doing something. How do I possibly coordinate that? I have to have some way of scaling this because there's a lot of people involved. Other times, maybe through accidental complexity or possibly intentional complexity, there's bad, gnarly problems. And so now we have to scale this thing in a dimension that's really difficult because complexity is just not a nonlinear problem. Sometimes it's about performance. Performance can mean a few things, right? I mean, performance can mean on the technical side of things. Performance could also mean getting teams to perform in a certain way, right? So like, how do we take these practices and how do we make it so everybody is doing the same practices kind of ad nauseum? Sometimes a last kind of idea there for you is that sometimes people conflate scaling with spreading. Right, scaling is kind of taking like one thing and just kind of like, if you have you've all seen like that art where it's like, I took a paperclip and now it's a really big paperclip. Like, so you've scaled the paperclip and made it better. It has the same properties. It's just kind of bigger. That's different than spreading, right? That's different than taking boxes of paperclips and just throwing them everywhere. Now everybody has paperclips, right? And so sometimes what happens is when we're thinking about scaling, we're actually conflating it with spreading. And so these are just possible things we could think of. The way this starts to play out though is like, Zoom always gets in my way. When I think about scaling, I start to ask questions to understand what people mean by scaling. And so I think about these kind of vectors of scaling. Look, I'm sure we all have our own biases. I'll get to my own at the end around probably like the better ideas, around these things can mean. But look, if you're interested in scaling projects, that's fine. Let's just be honest and say we are about scaling projects. If we need a scale process, let's just call it that. Let's call it what it is, because we can't say we want to do all 5 of these and then do them justice, right? And so I start to use these frames, these vectors, and communicating with people when they're saying scaling. What do you actually mean? And it kind of, where does it fit in this spectrum in my mind? Because again, once we are intentional with one of these, we have natural trade-offs. So if I were to think about scaling projects, right? So, call it, what it is. This happens in a lot of organizations, right? And so possibly things aren't getting done, or they're trying to make sure that money is being spent appropriately, right? And so we have to scale projects. We have to have more projects going on. The up and down arrows there are meant to mean like, usually it affects across teams and within teams. Sometimes scaling projects, the desire is because we want more accurate planning, kind of like to Woody's thing. We need, if we have more projects, we need to get better at planning and better at estimating. And so we need to have more project managers to help us estimate and manage risk. Sometimes it's about optimizing time, right? If we play Tetris with the database administrators and the sysadmins and the SREs, and we play Tetris just right, everybody will be busy all the time. Usually it's a fundamental cause because we're skill constrained. And again, I'm not trying to be harsh here on anybody, but typically when I see organizations that are more focused on scaling projects, what ends up happening is they end up growing their project management structure. They grow their project management structure because of and you have more overhead. And so now you need more managers to manage the overhead of all the projects. And again, we can all say you shouldn't scale projects. My take on it is, as long as we're honest about what we're doing, let's just if we can start there, that's a good point, right? And so let's talk about where it's at. If we want to scale process, right? Everybody's favorite. What might be some reasons to do this? It could be to address complexity. We have all this accidental complexity in our architecture. Therefore, if all the teams follow the same process and we just coordinate dependencies a certain way, surely we'll have success. your mileage may vary on those kinds of things, but typically what we're trying to do there is we're scaling a process to address complexity because we're not doing it a different way. Other times I've seen groups want to scale process because it's easier to manage. I can monitor and I can measure everybody the same way if they do the same process. Again, might not be the best idea, but again, if we're being honest about it, I've seen organizations that want the same process for everybody because you know what? It's just easier in the tool that way. I'm sure everybody has their favorite Jira story about the workflow that everybody has to use, but nobody wants to use it. But if you all use it, it all works in the tool the better if we all do the same process. And then lastly, let's just be honest. If everybody is doing the same process, it's way easier to train people, right? If you want to get everybody certified in a certain thing, kind of rinse, wash, repeat. It's easier to do these things. Now, typically when you end up scaling process, you're going, across these teams. It's this focus is, one process needs to be adopted by all the teams. Again, to me, it just feels like usually the simple answer to the wrong question. And I feel like that's where a lot of things get hung up. But again, if the goal is, we want consistency of metrics and we're trying to train people really fast, we're trying to make sure, and we just acknowledge that we're all just about making sure the process is repeated. If that's success, then cool. Let's just acknowledge it and move on. Other times, we want to scale teams. I don't know if you've all ever seen this pattern. We have a team of 8 and they're not getting enough done. So we need to hire more people so they can get more done. And now that we've hired more people, now there's too many people. Now we need to have 2 teams. And now they're still not getting enough done. So we need to hire more people. And so you get this cyclical effect where we're talking about scaling teams because we want to get more done, right? We want to get stuff done faster. And so those are typically the trigger points. Now, sometimes a possible approach for scaling teams is you've identified new skills and you want to bring new, fresh skills into the team. And so sometimes that's how we end up scaling teams, is by bringing in new skills. But the majority of the times, I see teams scaled to meet the demand, to meet unmet demand. So we need to scale teams. Worst case scenarios, I've seen, this person's been here for 5 years. They want to become an associate director. That means they need to have more people to report to them. So we better hire some more people, blah, blah, blah. That's not very interesting, but it happens. Again, are we trying to scale teams? Are we trying to scale to meet more initiatives? The easy one, right? Scaling technology. We could be scaling technology because we want more availability or throughput, easier to extend. Just the market's changed, technology has changed, and so we need to scale technology differently. That's typically a more interesting and direct one. I don't see a lot of people conflating scaling technology with scaling process. Although, as I'm sure we've all experienced, if we're trying to scale technology and we have already scaled our process where everybody has to approve everything, scaling technology gets kind of difficult. So again, we want to be careful of what we're choosing to scale and the impacts it has. And then the last one that I think about, that I think a lot of organizations sometimes mean when they talk about scaling, is that they want to actually scale their products. They actually have identified new opportunities and they want to have more customers. More customers means more revenue, means more money. That's an interesting thing. You could have new features, maybe that's it, but maybe you've identified new opportunities. And so now you actually want to grow your product offering. Totally different than trying to scale process, totally different than trying to scale projects, totally different than just trying to grow more teams. This is being intentional with your products. Maybe you've identified new audiences or markets. Maybe you have new ideas on experiments to run. And so you're trying to figure out, how can we learn faster? How could we experiment faster? How do we scale it and make it so teams can experiment more easily? That's an interesting question, man. That's way more interesting than how do we make sure everybody does the same process? And so again, starting with this idea of like, what are the possible vectors of scaling? And let's just get on the same page about that. Before you even worry about scaling though, obviously make sure you agree upon the domain you're trying to solve. Are you trying to make it easier to measure people? Are you trying to make it easier to manage projects? Are you trying to make it so you have more skills on your team? Are you trying to make it so you have better technology and more availability? Are you trying to actually respond to new opportunities for your products? Based upon what you're trying to solve, your scaling ideas need to be congruent with that desire. So there are options, right? But with all options, there are trade-offs. If you choose to scale projects, this is typically what happens. This is typically what happens and what we see. I bring it up this way because we can't do all 5 at one time. I mean, this is how you get like, we're doing the transformation for year 7 because we haven't finished out, how to figure out transforming in year 6, blah, blah, blah. It's because you don't know what you're doing, because you're trying to do everything at once. If you're trying to scale projects, if you're trying to make sure management is happy and everybody's busy all the time, I guarantee you're going to scale your process. You're going to scale your process, meaning, agile stuff. You're going to scale your process around risk management. You're going to scale all the process. Who can approve things? Because you have so many things going on that it's noise. And so the process increases. The technology is ignored. The products are ignored because they're not as important as the projects. Typically, I see the teams be de-emphasized when we're scaling projects. And I mean that because when you have so many projects going on, there is no sense of team anymore, because everybody in the team has 6 different initiatives going on for 10 different managers. And so the whole idea of trying to make sure your teams are actually teams is out the window. Again, if this is what you want to emphasize, do it. Just realize you're giving up other things. There are trade-offs. If you want to scale the process, it's pretty similar to scaling projects, really, in my mind. Like, you don't worry about tech, you don't worry about products. You tend to get more projects going. I tend to see, when I see teams scaling process, I tend to see teams grow heavily, because once you have more process, you have more roles, you have more things that people are supposed to do inside the process. So you hire more people, and then you have more people. So you need more teams. And then you have all of this isolation and nobody can do it because of dependencies. So you have more teams to manage dependencies. When you scale the process, kind of bad things start to happen. Right. And so again, if that's what you want to do, cool. Just realize that you're going to get these byproducts of these things, right? And a lot of the times when we scale the process, we're usually better off by like not scaling the process and removing things. Scaling teams, right? You tend to create more communication channels, those kinds of things. Typically, when I see teams scaled, I don't see products scaled. Typically, what I see happen is, as we start adding more and more teams, those teams tend to lose context of what they're doing, because now there's so many teams doing pieces of things that they lose sight of the big picture. They also lose actual autonomy, and the ability to deploy and build, deploy, test, build, test, deploy without impacting other teams. I've seen groups where they scale teams really fast, and then they sit behind feature flags for 3 months because they have to wait for the other teams to catch up. So it's like lots of teams running really fast, going nowhere. When I've seen teams grow, I tend to see projects increase because you have lots of teams now doing lots of things. The process tends to go up over time because there becomes dependencies with lots of teams. And so now we've just kind of exacerbated the problem. Usually the process is a fat tail kind of thing that happens later on. And the tech kind of comes or goes. Sometimes if we're bringing new technology and we scale teams, we get a new tech. Sometimes the tech becomes de-emphasized. It's kind of an in the middle kind of thing. But again, when you're scaling teams, I don't see people talking about products. I see teams get more disconnected from products. And again, scaling tech's the easy one, right? It's when we're focusing on scaling tech, we're usually not worrying about projects or process. I have seen when people talk about scaling technology, they do think about their products more, because they start thinking about the technology in the vein of the product and how it helps the product. But that's really can go either way. And then usually when you have new tech, you have skills in the teams. And so these things tend to get emphasized. So again, we're scaling tech. We tend to not emphasize projects or process, sometimes products, sometimes teams. And then of course, the fun one, everybody's favorite. When we start actually looking at scaling products, finding new opportunities, finding ways of experimenting, this is where it gets more fun for me, because then we don't worry about the process and we don't worry about the projects, because we start to realize if we're trying to grow our impacts and grow our customer base, we're not going to be measuring how many story points a team finishes. We're more interested in the results we're getting from the things that are finished. We're not worried about if everybody's following the same process, because they should follow the process that works for them, given the context of their product. And so when we can get people to think about scaling products, the process and the projects start to go away, which is really fun. We can start thinking about what's the least amount of process we need to get the products done in a nice way. Tech tends to come more involved when we're scaling products. You know, we at a certain point in time, we need to have new technologies to see how it benefits the products. Teams kind of, to me, goes horizontal. Sometimes we have too many teams. And so by focusing on products, we start to lose teams. We start to condense teams. We start to spread out responsibilities so we don't need isolation. But sometimes we grow teams because we have new technology. But again, scaling products, if we can get organizations to focus on that and not on, I don't know what just happened, and not in the process. We also there?
Yep.
That was pretty wild, huh? Oh, 1 second here.
Yeah, looks like we just lost your slides. That's it.
Yeah, I'm trying. There we go. I got them back. That was wild. They just went white on me. Yeah, and so like when we can talk about scaling products, it's just a much more interesting conversation. Things to consider when you're choosing this, and of course, the magic question: should you do it all at once, or I don't do it all at once? I would tell anybody this: if you have to ask which vector to choose, just it's an easy question for me. What are you actually in business for, right? My guess is, no one's buying Netflix because they're really good at Scrum. All right, that's just kind of not how it works. When you're thinking about which vector to choose, this is the kind of stuff I tend to advise, right? And like no one gets it right. If you want to choose and you say like let's scale products, there is no kind of this is how to do it. You need to figure out on your own. You need to learn on your own outcomes and feedback. Learn and adapt as you go. The book from Taiichi Ohno. Taiichi Ohno wrote the Toyota Way book as well as Workplace Management. He would talk about the reason why Taiichi Ohno, obviously, if he wrote the Toyota Way, he was at Toyota. In this book, Workplace Management, he talks about why he didn't care if he gave away all the secrets of Toyota. And his point was, it didn't matter if he told you what Toyota did now. If you tried to repeat it, you wouldn't have success because you wouldn't have the benefit of all the knowledge getting there on your own. And so that's the same thing. I think a lot of people want to pick a scaling vector. I think they want to choose scaling products, but then they start with saying, we want to scale products. What's the process that everybody did to scale products? And they want to copy somebody else instead of learning their way to get there. I've never seen that work. So here's my challenge for you all. What might happen if you didn't focus on any of those things and you just focused on learning and less about following what everybody else did? Don't worry about what Netflix does. Don't worry about Spotify. Just kind of learn what's happening inside your organization. Learning what customers need, right? That's the fun thing. But then these last three, learning what teams need, learning how to make the work easy, learning how to continuously learn. Some of these things I'm sure Woody might have even mentioned. Woody, when we've done work with Woody, Woody will talk a lot around how do we make it easier for people to do work. For me, that's a lot in the same vein of how do we help teams learn what they need to learn, and then organizations learn what they need to learn to make it easier for teams to do good work. This wonderful white paper, which actually was referenced to us by Woody, talks about this performance gap kind of here in the center, right? There's this desired performance in organizations and the actual performance. And typically what happens when we identify a gap between where an organization wants to be and where they actually are, what happens is you get this pressure to do more work, right? You increase the pressure to do work, which increases the time spent working, which for a short period of time will improve your performance. It's the work harder loop, right? We're not getting done what we need to do. Everybody kind of buckle down, death march, all that other kind of horrible stuff, so we can have a small blip in the radar. But in reality, what we want to do is we actually want to be able to spend time on improvement, invest in capabilities, invest in learning, invest in growing, and that over time will actually reduce the performance gap, and then actually reduces the pressure to do work, reduces time spent working. And so my challenge for everybody is, how do we stop worrying about scaling things that give us more pressure to do work and more time spent working, or even worse, more time spent in meetings? And how do we actually focus more on how do we make it easier for people to learn? How do we scale experimentation? How do we scale the ability to learn rapidly? When I think about when organizations become learning focused and we emphasize instead, I don't want to call it scaling learning, because as soon as you talk about scaling learning, somebody is going to say, yep, let's put it all in Confluence and let's make sure everybody has access to YouTube or the other online courses. And to me, that's not scaling learning. That's just scaling, reading. When I think about scaling learning, it's learning by doing. It's doing things different ways in the context of your work, of course, because if you're not doing in the context of your work, it's not as real. Right. It's hopefully this doesn't offend anybody. I've seen people teach test-driven development with Legos. And then they would tell the engineers, like, now that you get it with Legos, let's write some code. And it never worked, nor did it make sense. I don't know. And so, like, you have to, if you want to focus on learning and making it easy for people to learn. This is wild. See, this is Linux, right? Let me stop screen sharing. There you go. Let me go up to her. If we focus on learning in our work and making it easier for people to work, this is what I've seen. The process goes away. The process, it becomes no process. It becomes, what's the simplest thing that we can work on together and learn something on today? Technology or a product or something else. Projects go away, because if you're trying to learn, and with the stuff we work on, we build as teams. And so learning individually doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we can't talk about projects. We have to talk about teams being actually teams and learning together how to build stuff together. And so, like, the whole idea of projects has always gone away. Products, it gets way more emphasized, because now all of a sudden we're trying to learn in context, and to have context, we have to understand our products. Tech gets really emphasized, because it turns out tech is important to build products. And so we have to know how to do things well. We have to, have nice, well-designed code, good modularity, write some tests, help with explanation, make it easy for everybody to build and deploy, not have 100 branches. Like, all of these things get emphasized really quick when we start figuring out how to learn, because if we don't do the small things well in the technology side, it's really hard to learn. It's really hard to learn if you spend half your day debugging why your environment doesn't work, versus just kind of like having good build scripts or good deploy scripts or configuration as code. Like, all that learning goes out the window. But when you focus on learning, then you fix those things, and the technology becomes much better. And it seems it becomes kind of either grows or shrinks. But I can just tell you this, like, if we can change the conversation away from, like, how do I scale process, or how do I get more projects going, or how do I get more throughput, and we just talk about how do we make it easier for people to learn more quickly, and talk about scaling that ability to learn, that's a good place to be in. And that's kind of what I like. here's the catch. It is labor intensive. I am not going to lie to you. This is not an easy thing to do, right? And so if we want to focus on learning, you can't have people multitasking on 25 different things. Like, we have to be intentional with what we're choosing to do. Additionally, you have to have good people that are on your team that are taking opportunities to teach each other as well as experiment as a team. And it's labor intensive. The idea of it being labor intensive, we actually got from Kent Beck. We did this little thing a few years back, the year before COVID, talking about, kind of learning and talking about the early days of XPs and how some of the katas and some of the early, even the coaching dojos early on. And Kent was saying early on, he was trying to have XP focus more on learning. And he said it was always hard because it was so labor intensive and everybody would balk at the cost of it. And so I am not going to lie to you. The biggest challenge in organizations is the idea that spending money on learning is not a good idea. I've had organizations that have rushed to build things without even having hardware or even licenses for the tools in place, which all that meant was everybody was busy making things up, but they would not slow down to experiment on things or to try things a different way. So organizations have a hard time with this idea of speed versus I would maybe call it rate of delivery versus rate of learning. There tends to be a lot more emphasis on rate of delivery, where our biggest struggles are on the rate of learning. And so again, if we can take it more towards being learning focused, it's a good spot to get into. The easy ways for organizations to get into like this idea of scaling learning, obviously the enablers and platforms. I don't mean enablers in the horrible like safe sense. Like there's simple things that like if you have if the teams inside your organization are using like Terraform and you have good modules, those are enablers. And if you have a good open source or inner source community inside your organizations, those are enablers. Like those are good things to have. You can have good platforms that it makes it easy for people to build and learn and test with. Those are nice, simple ways to get linear growth at a lower cost. Organizations can have team-to-team learning, which is actually wonderful for an organization's culture. And again, if you start focusing on learning and becomes the norm, then this idea of teams learning from each other just becomes, how we work. The other idea, if this idea of learning and scaling learning becomes a thing, is that you don't have to do all the teams at once, which is also, I think, something that a lot of organizations struggle with. Is they might say, learning sounds pretty good, but like, how would that possibly scale? We have 10,000 teams. And the easy answer is, yeah, you probably don't want to have all 10,000 teams doing, focusing on learning at the same time, at least initially, because I guarantee you all 10,000 teams, they're not, I don't want to say of the equal importance, but the products they work on have different impacts and they're on different points of a life cycle. And so like saying like, you might want to start with where's the best investment for your learning. I think like, I forgot the dude's name now. Maybe it was, I'm gonna call him Dave. I don't know if it was Dave or not. But somebody was saying, starting small before you worry about expanding. Maybe if you want to scale learning, you start figuring out the right teams to learn with before you worry about scaling it out and kind of expanding outwards. If you're trying to kind of get faster growth and faster spreading of learning opportunities, social learning inside organizations and having internal coaches is a wonderful thing. But again, if you can't sense my bias enough, whenever I get in these conversations around scaling, I first want to understand what they mean. And then I am constantly trying to redirect it towards, well, what would happen if we were actually able to learn faster? What would happen if more teams were able to learn faster? And if I can start redirecting the language that way, and then I get out of all the process nonsense, I tend to get out of all the project nonsense. I kid you not, I tend to get out of all the tool nonsense even, because it becomes the point where it's not about the tools, it's about us rapidly learning. And let's kind of focus on that. If we have to use a tool, let's use it to record what's happening, but let's not use the tool to drive anything, right? And so this is just nice conversations that you can get to. Start with grounding on what people expect from scaling, maybe kind of gently correct them a little bit towards this idea of learning, and then see how the world can be better. Last few slides here for you. If you don't know Mary, Mary's a wonderful person, Mary Poppendick and Tom. The simple thing here is the people closest to the work know the challenges with the work. And so like if I'm thinking about where to start with knowledge, I'm listening to the people doing work, right? Because they know what their challenges are. Again, not trying to be harsh on any managers or executives. The majority of the managers and executives that I work with or talk to, they don't really have the same answers as the team does for what the challenges are. And so I really wanted to get as close to the people doing the work as possible to understand what's actually happening, listen to them. If there's lots of firefighting, that never helps. Escalations never help. Kind of get close to the problem. Let's figure out what the challenges are. Let's focus on learning. Let's not focus on firefighting. Let's not focus on escalations. Let's get to the root of the matter. Great ways to learn. This is what I stress for a lot of groups. So like if we're going to focus on growing, learning, and scaling that kind of aspect, try multiple options. Just because you were able to copy and paste one off Stack Overflow and it worked doesn't mean it's the best option. With the teams that I tend to work with, we do kind of, again, that small experimentation, but like we will try call it a story, call it getting a test to pass, call it a small piece of code we're going to work on. We might try it 2 or 3 different ways, because we learn more by, even if we did it the best way possible the first time, by doing it the second way, a not as good way, we can then talk about why the first way was better and have a concrete example. So I want to try things, I want to do the same thing over and over, and it might sound horrible, and I'm not doing it for every single test or things like that, but of things of substance, I'm going to do it a few times. We're going to do it a few times as a team, and we're going to talk about what was good about one approach, what was better about a different approach, what was hard about one approach. Sometimes what happens is you might find that you wrote the code a certain way and it's really elegant, but new people couldn't figure it out. I mean, you wrote this other way and it was really easy to understand, but it wasn't quite as performant. And so now you have this interesting thing that you can actually talk about. And you can do, if you want to scale that, everybody can do that. Like all teams can talk about that, right? So those are good things to do. Ensemble working style or mob programming, right? Those are wonderful ways for people to learn and kind of create this focus on growing learning inside your organization. Having curiosity is obviously a great aspect, right? That desire to experiment. That if we could talk in less certainty and in more kind of curiosity, that would be great for a lot of organizations and a lot of people. Reserving judgment's a wonderful thing, right? I had a group that I was working with doing some Azure stuff. This one tech lead on the team, wonderful dude. Somebody had an idea that they wanted to try and he just said no. He's like, we're not going to do it that way. It's wrong. And so I had to talk to him one-on-one, and I go, I get it, dude. And I go, you might be right, but I go, if we just rush to that judgment, we're robbing that person that opportunity, that learning opportunity. So I go, let's just see how it goes, man. Let's give it a try for 2 hours. The next day we did, and it turns out that the tech lead was wrong. Now, he wasn't wrong because he's a bad person or he's wrong. He was wrong because he actually understood the question differently than the person that wanted to try it. And so we had this kind of gap in knowledge, or gap in expectations. And so again, this is why I want to try multiple times, multiple things. This is why I want us to work together. This is why I want curiosity. This is why I want to reserve judgment. Doing that all the time in the context of the team's work, and then just making it easier for everybody to do that. Way more rewarding. Don't confuse activity for progress. Don't confuse moving with going somewhere. Don't confuse scaling with something better, right? Just because you scaled something doesn't mean it's better or it's good. Just because things are everybody's busy doesn't mean you're going anywhere, right? If just because your team's able to finish 250 story points doesn't mean that it's a good product. Let's not worry about these maybe call them vanity metrics or kind of bad ideas. Let's focus on making it easier for people to learn, making it simple for people to have joy in their work, make it simple for people to just build better products. I think if we scale, look, I'm not Rich Sheridan. I'm not trying to be hippie-ish. If we focus on making it joyful for people to build products, and so they're not like, man, so-and-so won't ever approve this thing and I can't deploy my thing. And this person's, if we just stopped all that nonsense and focused on removing the problems, we don't have to even worry about scaling. I guarantee you, your teams will start crushing it. So yeah, in closing, words to me matter a ton. Like words have always mattered a ton. These are just some examples. Yeah, obviously scaling there at the bottom, words that I kind of, I don't even call it trigger me. But they kind of, when I hear them, I'm like, when I hear teams say they did that, or over there that happened, or back then that happened, that's kind of language that I'm like, but there's something we have to be able to do now together. So like, let's kind of reframe the language. I'm big on kind of reframing language, I guess. People talking about the business, the business wants this, the business wants this, as if IT wasn't in the business. I mean, it's just, I can't imagine anybody would hire an engineer that doesn't care about the business. It just seems asinine. Calling people resources instead of people, I mean, it's just kind of bad. The language around certainty versus experimentation, that always kind of, I look out for those things. And this idea of budget and cost accounting versus impact or opportunities. Those kinds of things I always look out for. And then, I mean, I'm not trying to be tie these things back to situations, but like if you think about some of these trigger words, the business and resources, those tend to feel more like you're trying to scale process or you're trying to scale projects. And if you're talking a lot in certainty, I guarantee you're talking about scaling projects because you're certain everything you're going to do is right. You just got to do it more quickly. And if you're worried about budget instead of like the cost of your opportunities, I guarantee you're not even worrying about scaling products. You're thinking more about, again, this scaling projects. And so what I'm looking for is there incongruency in the language that the organization is saying and their actions, right? If they're talking about scaling this and scaling products, but they're measuring things all wrong, like we just got to fix the language because we can't have both. All it's going to do is kind of aggravate people. Understand the context, know the trade-offs, right? Look, scaling isn't the problem. I don't know if it has been, but I would love to find out that it is. There you go. Everybody's favorite quote from Woody, or maybe not your favorite quote, but one from him, right? It's in doing the work you discover the work to do, right? You can process and project manage the things out as long as you want, and then reality hits and you find out all the things you got to do anyway, right? So you do need to have. I would tell you this. Woody's obviously on one side of the spectrum, on the no estimate side of things. I don't know if I go as far as Woody. I think you don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but at the same point in time, I think it's good to understand the expected magnitude of a cost, right? Like if somebody were to say, can you build, a new Tesla? And I would say, sure, I'll do it one piece at a time. It might take me $100 million because I have no idea how to build a Tesla. And somebody would say, you should tell me it's $100 million before you started. And that's a fair question. But if we can talk in orders of magnitude, is it $10? Is it $100,000? Is it $1 billion? That feels like enough to me, but I digress. We discover a lot of the work to do by doing work. We discover a lot of the things that we need to do by learning, right? It's this fundamental thing. Don't worry about the scaling, do the learning side of things. There you go. That's the slides. Fire away with questions. I don't even know how fast or how slow I went. Not bad, I guess.
Joel, that was great. There were so many awesome points. One thing that kind of came to mind was as you're navigating teams towards optimizing and scaling for learning, how have you handled this realization that with learning comes failure? Like, right, they're like related, and there has to be this safety net in place to say failure is okay because we're optimizing for learning.
Yeah, so there's a variety of things that kind of come up in that. The first thing, of course, is establishing perimeters outside the team, because the first thing I stress with groups before I work with teams is things are going to be slow, especially early on. And so I do that because it's a simple thing. Like, we're going to be focusing on learning. So I tell managers, I go, look, however you're managing output, expect half for the first few weeks. Let's just start there. Now, the reality is nobody knows how to measure output in any reasonable way. So that's just kind of out the window anyway. But I try and create this buffer initially so we don't get kind of squashed. When I'm with teams, we'll talk kind of about where we're going. But then the work oriented part of it is focusing on really small things together at a time. We do mob programming. We'll do one thing at a time, kind of single piece flow. So like everybody does things and everybody shares. But we also set up these things where we do when we're doing the mobbing, we'll of course have like the least senior person driving, and more, so like the navigator has to explain things more. We'll stress things early on for teams that we're going to do things multiple times, right? So like I set expectations with teams that we're going to do things multiple times. Even if we do it right the first time, we're going to do it again. If we do it wrong, it's fine, because we're going to do it again. And so we try and do a bunch of those things. The other thing we try and do, there's this, if you can all see this, there's this nice book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety by Dr. Timothy Clark. He does some nice things in there. He talks about like four stages of safety, and there's things that have to be in place to get there. And so like the stage 1 is just inclusivity. And so if people don't feel included, they're not going to have learner safety. And so like, if I'm working with a team, we're very clear that I don't care about the roles. We're all going to be doing things together. There's no one person responsible for anything. We're all here to do things together. And so we're trying to like use inclusive language all the time. Even like, this might sound silly, and this might be another example for you here, but like we still have teams doing stand-ups. Yeah, that's fine. But like the stand-ups that we do are meant to use inclusive language, meaning, so like I don't do stand-ups where it's like, what did you do, Anthony? What did you do, Alex? What did you do, Nick? What are you going to do later? What's blocking you? I don't care. What I care about is, hey, we all had an idea on what we wanted to learn. And so I always frame kind of like the outcomes in learning. We're trying to learn this thing. It could be we're trying to learn something about our product. We're trying to learn something about our technology. So I'm framing things around learning. And then the question for the group is, did we learn anything interesting yesterday that might change what we want to do? Did we learn anything interesting that we want to explore more broadly? And so I'm talking about the things we're trying to achieve, and I'm asking what we did, what we're doing about it. I never use language that's individual based. And so it's always kind of around keeping it safe, keeping it us, keeping us together, keeping it outcome focused. It's all those little things over and over again. When I'm working with teams, so like typically when I'm working with teams, just kind of give you kind of context, I'm usually with teams about 6 hours a day, usually about 4 or 5 days a week, then usually for about 6 weeks. The first day or two, it's a little bumpy. And so like I've never had a team after 2 days like just crushing it. Like usually they're hitting their first bump, and we get through it together. And usually by the 4th or 5th day, man, I tell you, like people are just the language changes within the teams, but it's a lot of being intentional over and over and over again with language. So like there's even times where I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling on this, but so I promise this is the last point. There'll be plenty of times where a team will be having a conversation and it's just kind of spiraling, right? And so like what we'll do is we'll just pause the team and we'll say, it feels like this is hard for us, right? And so it's not about anybody's opinion. It feels like this is hard for us. Let's put aside solving it for now, and let's just talk about what's making it hard for us right now. And so again, it's not about you. Anthony has a different view than Nick. It's about this, like it senses, it feels hard for us. Let's not solve it right now. Let's just get these things out and then kind of move on. So it's a lot of these little subtle things over and over again with teams to make it good to communicate, to make it safe to try things. And then you get to this point where, I'll have, I had an executive director working on a mobile app with me, last fall. And he didn't want anybody to see him code because he was, executive director in IT and he couldn't code. We got him past it. And that was an awesome moment, because then everybody else was like, oh man, he's vulnerable. Now I can be vulnerable too. And it's just all these little things. We got to be vulnerable together. Man, that was long. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine, but it made a ton of sense. Thank you. And then also, in case anyone doesn't have chat open, I dropped a link to your book, Creating Your Dojo. So if you're interested, it's there in chat for anyone that wants to pick it up.
Thanks, dude. Other questions
for the hecklers?
Or hecklers?
Anyone else have a question?
If you didn't get the takeaway, I am not a big scaling process kind of dude. I just want things simple. I want people to be happy. I want it to be easy to work on things, because man, it's really fun building cool products. It is not fun saying why can't I deploy something? Why can't I change this? That's just not fun, man. And it's even less fun where it's well, put a ticket in so that team can check their story points against you. I don't care, man. I just want it to be easy.
If we're talking about, scaling, let's say Scrum, one of the things that I've seen and I get frustrated with is that I don't think people truly understand how to scale and why you scale. I think people get more caught up in, well, I probably should scale this, so I'll just scale it without understanding it. And I've thought about this, and I kind of look at it as I'm a big believer in scaling. And an example that I can come up with is, if you've ever looked at somebody who's learning how to use a PC and they store files all on their desktop. So there's 1,000 files on the desktop, right?
Yeah.
Humans are not designed, nor do they have the memory to be able to deal with that. So I believe the idea of scaling probably came about because it's much easier for us to understand and organize and containerize. And not only is it good for that, but it also allows for robustness. So in my own experiences, what I've seen is probably the best people that are best at scaling are software architects. Because, if you're going to be a successful architect, you better understand how to scale. But if you take people who, in my opinion, they're not even software developers and they're sort of in charge of doing this, I don't think they really have the experience and the insight to properly scale. And if they don't, then it could be a total disaster, because if you scale wrong and it's not well understood, it's sort of like if you've ever looked at hierarchy charts and you say to yourself, who came up with this hierarchy chart? I mean, I don't understand how you're organizing this. You have things off to the left, you have things off to the right. They don't really look like siblings. Who came up with this? This is a disaster. And, a hierarchy chart, nobody really cares about that, unless you're an executive. But if you got to design software and you screw up how your architecture, when I say architecture, I mean the architecture of your scaling, and you screw that up and it's not really intuitive for most people, it's kind of bad, because that's how you're organizing your work.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I think that was Dave. Like, good architects. There's another talk out there you can find where I talk about like architecture and products, but like the takeaway is like with architecture, not all architectural decisions have the same weight. And so like I like your analogy, because I would offer up the same thing for like scaling. Like if you're trying to scale an approach, not all, like there's certain things you have to get right, and there's certain things you probably won't be as bad if you don't get right, and there's certain things you can't possibly get right until kind of reality happens. Like one of the things I used to do when I was at the Futures Exchange in Chicago, I did the whole ranks. I would end up being the enterprise architect and blah, blah, blah. And I would talk about, there were certain things I had to get right in my design. I had to get network right. I had to get latency right, because trades have to be fast. There were certain things I couldn't possibly get right because the market would change. And so like if I was talking about data sharding or how I was kind of branching out or distributing data, I couldn't get right. I could talk about historically how the data went, but it would change day to day and it would change in the future. So I had to be really malleable inside there. And then there was things kind of that we had to think about, but that were easier to swap out. And so I like your analogy, because as long as if we talk about good architecture, you have to have an architect that's close to the problem domain. And we have to acknowledge that there's not every decision point has the same weight. And so there's certain things we need to be intentional about. How do we get right? I would offer up that, like, if we're trying to scale and how products get built inside of an organization, using like domain-driven design and those kind of concepts where we actually get good boundaries is a nice way of thinking about those things, because then we have good if you want to scale that way, you're going to have good isolation, good modularity, make it easier for people to do things. But you might not necessarily know the size of the teams or the process for the teams that's going to work best, because inside those various domains, they might work at different cadences and they're going to have different constraints. And so like, I like your idea of scaling, but I think we have to be aware of, different decision points and the cost of those decision points.
I mean, if you think about like, so there's two major ones that I think of in scaling. One is top down and one is bottom up. So if you take the top down version, you have the business leaders who at the very top are saying, okay, these are our key objectives. This is what our plans are and where the company is going or the organization is going. And so they roll out like top level objectives. And then the next level looks at those objectives and says, okay, at my level and with my experience, I am going to make those more detailed. And each level below it makes it even more detailed. And hiring more people is fine, because people today are not jack of all trades. They're all specialists. Everybody today is a specialist. So, you may be a middle layer person where that's what your experience is. So you may not know how to write a requirement. You may not know how to do a lot of things at a certain level, but at, let's say, a middle or a higher level, you know how to do those things. So it's okay if you add all of those people, because that's what they know how to do, and that's what they're going to do best. So I don't see adding the overhead as a problem either, as long as you're a large organization. But you're breaking down the work at each level. If you have like millions and millions and millions of lines of code, you have to somehow be able to organize that. You can't just throw it all on the desktop. Trust me, I've seen code that winds up on the desktop, and you don't want to go there, because what happens is you either go out of business because you can't maintain it, or you have to like build up all this technical debt and then basically redesign it, and you can't afford it. So you want to come up with a half decent architecture, and you want to make sure that that architecture is robust.
Yep. I saw you come off mute, Anthony. Was there?
No, I was just going to see if anyone else had any questions before we wrap. I will say on the last topic, there's an interesting talk that I like to share by Rafi Krikorian. He was the VP at Twitter when they made the shift from monolithic Ruby on Rails app to web services. And he talked about the talk is called How Your Organization is Killing Your Software. And Dave, I think it's a good one. I think you'll enjoy it because I think it touches on a lot of that. And he had some very simple rules as they kind of grew at Twitter. And it was make sure teams can be an expert in something and that they can deliver that end to end and scale that way. Because otherwise, no one was an expert in anything and they would have to have committees to decide, how to add geolocation to a tweet. And then it would have to pass through 7 different teams' hands. So they could never get it out. So good, lots of, that's the Reader's Digest version. I think it's a really good talk and probably touches on some of that.
And adding on top of that, what I would also say is probably the most important thing out of anything that I can think of as an agile coach is you absolutely 110% need the people in the C-suite to be backing either your transformation or backing the work that's being done in an agile manner. Because if you don't have that, then the bureaucracy is going to take it over.
Anthony, I just did a quick search. I couldn't find anything on YouTube. Can you drop some keywords or a link if you had it?
Yeah,
Find that.
I do have it. It might take me a minute to find it.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
What was it? Twitter or was it Basecamp? I thought it was Basecamp.
Rafi was at Twitter. He had just left. He was at Uber, I think, by the time he gave the talk, but he was reflecting on his time at Twitter, and he moved on since then. I do. Okay, I think this is it. Just give me 1 second. Sorry for the delay. I should have found it first before I mentioned it.
No worries. Thanks for digging that up.
2016. So it's dating. It's going back a ways. I'll drop it in chat. I can also post it on our.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, hang on. I think I sent a direct message. Hang on. Let me send it to everybody. Well, before we wrap, Joel, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have anything to promote or anything before we go? I'd love to give you that opportunity.
No, I mean, we'll have a book coming out at the end of the summer, but I don't know when or even the title, so don't sweat that.
Okay. Well, we'll have to have you back when the book comes out then.
There you go. There you go. All right. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening.
Awesome. Thank you,
All
Joel.
right. Take care, everyone. And thank you, Joel. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Gotta love hecklers, man.
I'll post that YouTube video to the chat.
Thanks. All right, man. I'll catch you later.
Sounds good.
Yep. See ya.
See ya.